mahasiswa juga dapat mengakses ribuan jurnal nasional dan internasional. Selain itu, FikomUnpad juga memiliki bidang riset yang sangat luas. Sistem administrasi Fikom terintegrasi secara online, sehingga mahasiswa aktif dan efisien. FikomUnpad memiliki 9 program studi, di antaranya vokasi atau diploma, manajemen komunikasi, ilmu komunikasi, hubungan masyarakat, ilmu informasi dan perpustakaan, jurnalistik, film dan televisi, magister, dan doktor. FikomUnpad memiliki banyak fasilitas yang menunjang minat dan bakat mahasiswa. Terdapat 11 unit kegiatan mahasiswa. Mahasiswa dapat mengembangkan hobi, minat, dan bakat mereka di sana. FikomUnpad telah mendapat berbagai penghargaan, di antaranya penghargaan sebagai Fakultas Ilmu Komunikasi terbaik di Indonesia selama 6 tahun berturut-turut. Selain itu, FikomUnpad juga terpilih sebagai partner The Pacific and Asian Communication Association. Berikut kerjasama Fikom dengan berbagai instansi dan universitas mancanegara: Universitas Erfurt, Jerman, Monash University, Australia, Leiden University, Belanda, Universitas Bilgi, Turki, dan masih banyak. Fikom berkomitmen untuk konsisten mencetak lulusan-lulusan yang penuh kreativitas serta kompetitif. Bersama Universitas Padjadjaran, dari Jawa Barat untuk Indonesia ke pentas dunia.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm welcoming you to this Studium General of Media Research courses, and today we're going to talk about the media and the message in society, especially in Indonesia. We got Dr. Ross Tapsell coming all the way from Australia, from Canberra, actually. I would like to welcome Ross Tapsell for today's lecture. And before we're moving on to the general lecture or student general, we're going to have remarks from our Dean, Dr. Dadang Rahmat Hidayat. I would like to give the time for Dr. Dadang Rahmat Hidayat to have some remarks for today's general lecture. The time is yours, Mr. Dadang, if you be able to talk.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Sandy. Sorry, I'm double Zoom. Coincided with with the meeting at the university. Good morning, everyone. Professor Rostapsel, I respect, welcome. We are from the Australian National University. It is an honor for us to attend public lectures, student generals, with the theme, digital media as the message in Indonesian society. That's right. We hope to gain strengthen knowledge and understanding of this issue. We hope as an educational institution, the Faculty of Communication Science needs to look at the various curricula related to digitalization, and especially the program related to media, both mass media or social media, so that there are adjustments to the needs of the community. In addition, the Indonesian people still respond to the digital of this media differently. I think differently, depending on regulation, institution readiness, socialization, and of course the infrastructures. But of course, we can be silent. Once again, I really appreciate these public lectures. Thank you, Professor Rostapsel, Mr. Chandy, as the head of the study program, and Mr. Sauki, young gun from Fikom, who is currently in the land of kangaroo. Hopefully, the lecture and students can listen these lectures carefully. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dadang Ramadhan as our dean, for the opening remarks for this studium general or general lecture for today's. As of today, we're going to talk about digital media as the message in the Indonesian society. Before we are moving to the beginning of the general lecture, I would like to have an announcement on some do or don'ts in this general lecture. I would like to ask participants to open the camera for as long as the general lecture, and then you do kindly enough to mute your microphone at least before you can talk and being allowed to talk by the moderator. And then if there's any question or if you want to ask for something, you could just type on the chat and just ask on the chat, and then I'm going to deliver the question to Dr. Rostapsel afterwards. So I think that's it for the two interns. I would like to appreciate that all the participants to turn on the camera for the whole event. Thank you very much. And before we're moving on to the general lecture, I would like to read our speakers' curriculum vitae for today. Is Dr. Rostapsel. He's currently a senior lecturer at the Department of Gender, Culture and Media, School of Culture, History and Language, College of Asia and Pacific, the Australian National University, the same university as our colleague Shoki Lukman. Hopefully we'll be finished in this year. So Dr. Rostapsel is teaching at the ANU on undergraduate courses on Southeast Asian Society, Asian digital cultures, and Indonesian language, as well as master level course on Australia-Asia relations. And he won the College of, in 2012. He won the College of Asia and the Pacific Teaching Award. So now currently he has 3 PhD students to supervise and a panel of 3 others. Some of the publications that he had, one of them is the Media Power Indonesia, Oligarchy and Digital Revolution, which is very in quote famous in Indonesia. This book is really really opening a lot of Indonesian people in how media and oligarchy works in Indonesia. So this is one of the books that's really influential in media studies in Indonesia, especially. And a lot of journal articles and focusing on Indonesian, especially the media and digital media in current digital media. Okay. He also an editorial board of Scholar Journal Digital Asia since 2014, and also board member of ANU's New Mandala website, a space for scholarly analysis and underground research output, and have been involved with NM since 2013. And since 2019, he's been the board of member of the Australian Consortium of In-Country Research Studies, or ACICIS. We also regularly write for online academic sites such as Inside Story at Mandala, and also has written for New York Times, The Guardian, Sydney Morning Herald, and Vice, and also other publications in Southeast Asia region. And also a contributor to the television commentary on Indonesia and Malaysia on ABC TV and radio, and also appeared on the Drum, The World Today, and other international news organizations like CNBC, Al Jazeera, and the BBC. Probably that's it. That's the short CV that I have, and you can see a lot of publication, and the work of Dr. Ross Tapsell is really quite remarkable in a way. Some of them are really influential in how even people in Indonesia seeing the media, and how is the position of the media in politics and oligarchy as being happening today. So I will give the time for Dr. Ross Tapsell to deliver the lecture. The time is yours, Dr. Ross Tapsell. Thank you very much. I think it's still in mute mode.
There we go. Thank you. The host was function was not allowed for me. But thank you very much for the lovely introduction, Pak Chandra, and thank you to Dekan Dr. Dadang for the wonderful introduction, and thank you everyone for inviting me to speak at Universitas Padjadjaran. I watched the video just before of Universitas Padjadjaran, and it makes me kangen for Indonesia. It's been sudah lama sejak saya datang ke Indonesia, mungkin tahun 2019. Astaga.
Recording in progress.
So I really miss Indonesia, and I'd love to visit you in person one day. Hopefully, as the pandemic is, allowing for coming to an end in some capacity, and allowing for travel to Indonesia and so on. So it's great to be invited. It's great to be involved with Padjadjaran again. I've been to Bandung before, and always enjoy talking to students from Bandung who are always really across digital media and other forms of media production. So terima kasih banyak lagi for the invitation, and I will now begin my formal presentation. Okay, so I really want to just give an overview of what I think is the way to look at Indonesian history, culture, and politics from the perspective of the medium being the message, and to talk you through how I see Indonesia and the role that the media plays, a very important role that the media plays in Indonesian political and societal change. And so I see media studies and communication studies and political communication as not some periphery on the outside of study that, you know, is useful for maybe just for journalists or just for like PR executives to get a job in PR. No, I see it as absolutely central to the understanding of contemporary Indonesian society. And to understand that, I need to talk you through the importance of media and the message in Indonesian history and society. I put up my email and Twitter handle there if you'd like to get in touch at any time. And in order to understand media studies, the scholar who is most influential is, of course, a scholar that many of you would already know, and that's Marshall McLuhan, with his famous line, "The medium is the message." It is a line that is used a lot. It's not always understood. In fact, if you were to read McLuhan, Understanding Media, the book is very hard to understand. Even for someone like me, and English is a first language, I really don't understand everything that McLuhan is writing about with this topic. But what I understand is that McLuhan was influential because he was writing at a time when television was entering the new media of the world, and in particular America and North America and Canada. McLuhan was Canadian. And McLuhan was writing at a time where television was transforming society. Two important examples here that I've put up on the screen, which helped shape McLuhan's idea of how the medium is the message. And one is a debate between the American presidents, JFK and Richard Nixon, and they were debating about who should become president. And this was the first time that America televised the debate. And actually, when you look at the transcript of the debate, if you look at just what they were saying, you would find that Richard Nixon probably did a better job. He had more content, he had more details, he had more policy descriptions. But JFK was young, he was good looking, he smiled, he had nice white teeth. He was a charming man on screen. Richard Nixon was sort of hunched over, he had sweat, he looked uncomfortable, and he looked slightly angry. And so when people judged the debate, they said that JFK won. And so this made McLuhan think about how the medium itself it's not just the content that matters, but it's the form that media takes. It's the medium in how it shapes how people use it and how people view it and how people see it. And so for him, television was this revolutionary new medium which was shaping society in different ways. It wasn't so much, media scholars at that time were really saying that we needed to do more and more discourse analysis. We needed to do content analysis. And even in media studies departments today, there's really a strong sense that the best media studies work does content analysis. But McLuhan said, no, media studies is more important than just content analysis. Media studies is about how the medium shapes the message. And we need to look at the medium itself, not just the content. This was revolutionary for media studies. Another example at the time of McLuhan writing was the Vietnam War. And so for the first time, Americans were seeing war on TV in their living rooms during dinner time. And this led to a lot of Americans actually seeing the brutality, the violence, the destruction, the bombing of Vietnamese people in Vietnam, live and sometimes graphically shown in their lounge rooms, often while they're having dinner, watching the nightly news. And this led to a real push for an anti-war movement in which television was seen as central in the first instance to pushing that anti-war movement. People watching those images of death and destruction online really led to people being against the war in Vietnam. And so again, McLuhan was saying that it's the form that media takes which shapes war reporting. Previously, if it was just in print and just in the written word, it didn't have the same impact. But when you can see it and you can see the blood and the guts and the bombing and the children being napalmed, that just transforms the nature of war reporting. And so in a way, the medium is the message here when he's talking about the way that new media transforms society. So I want to talk about that in the context of Indonesia, because I think that in order to understand political change in Indonesia, in order to understand how the medium shapes the message, we need to understand how new media technologies have arrived in Indonesia and what that has done for Indonesian society. Now, I admit I am not the first person to make this argument. One of the earliest scholars to use this argument that new media shaped society was a scholar that many of you who would know is Benedict Anderson, whose famous work was actually conducted mostly in Java, but also in other areas of Southeast Asia, where he largely looked at the impact of print capitalism and the printed mass media that it had on society as a whole. And Benedict Anderson, as many of you know, argued in 1983 that the print media vernacular in the original languages allowed for the spread of ideas across the various regions and similar languages of the world, which ultimately led to the idea of the nation state, of nationalism. And of course, he was writing about Europe and Southeast Asia, but a lot of what Benedict Anderson did was originally from his research on Java and on Southeast Asia. And he really looked at the role of the national consciousness in Java and how print media allowed for the idea of Indonesian nationalism. So for Anderson, newspapers were essential to the idea of Indonesian independence, the spread out into the marketplace through the national language Bahasa Indonesia, which helped build solidarity among young elite Indonesians. The print media informed a collective understanding that there was a simultaneous experience of readers. The newspaper for Anderson was the key medium, not only because it enabled and encouraged print languages, but because it created imagining of a new kind of sovereign community. In his view, newspapers acted as vehicles for revolutionary ideals, and they carried new messages about a new nation, unifying a unified nation. So Benedict Anderson's theory, which is very famous and very well known and has been used for decades, is not dissimilar from McLuhan. They are similar in the idea that they emphasize the form of media, not solely the content which is produced. So for Benedict Anderson, the key medium was print, and the message it produced was the idea of the Indonesian nation. So one key point about this, and one criticism that you might have of this theory, is that, well, how many Indonesians could read in 1945 or 1943, right? And actually it was about 7%. About 7% of Indonesians were actually reading newspapers. But Anderson said it wasn't about the amount of people who were reading it. It was about whose agency was enhanced, who gained power from print media. And he said that it was ultimately the nationalists, whose ideas were spread out through coffee houses, the fact that everyone was talking about what was said in newspapers like Suara Merdeka or Berita Republik Indonesia, and the fact that there was this idea of this educated urban elites producing this idea of the sovereign community. And I mention this because I think it's important that we say that it's not always about the amount of people that are using digital media. It's not always about how the mass is engaging with it, but it's rather about whose agency, whose autonomy, whose power is increased by the introduction of the new media. Okay? So Anderson and McLuhan have really set up what we see now as this central idea of the medium shaping society. And that's where I take off point. Now, of course, by 1965, we saw what McLuhan had as this idea of this new medium of television, which transformed the nature of American society. And so too in Indonesia. television, with its centralized need for capital and communications infrastructure, was a perfect medium for an authoritarian regime to justify and legitimize its rule. The sole permitted television station, TVRI, was government owned and controlled. It was created in 1962 around the time of Sukarno's guided democracy, and quickly became what was described as the prime engine of the new order of Suharto's government. Television contributed to the feeling of nationness, but also is this idea of the legitimacy of the Suharto New Order regime, the idea that Suharto was the father of development, or the Bapak Pembangunan. And during the early years of the New Order, television aimed to unite Indonesians as a mass, all moving towards the same objective. TVRI largely produced state government messages, state-run messages, and they didn't really have much commercial advertising. And the Suharto regime really pushed TVRI and television in Indonesia. In fact, if you go to some parts of Indonesia all around the archipelago, some of you might be from Ambon, for example, or in parts of Sulawesi, and you go to a place like Kota Ambon, the biggest building on the hill there in Kota Ambon is the Gedung TVRI, which was built in about 1975. And the point being that the Suharto regime felt that the more television and TVRI that was created throughout the archipelago, the more idea there was that Suharto's Jakarta-centric, Java-centric regime should be legitimized throughout Indonesia. So print television basically became the crucial way to legitimize the authoritarian regime. You don't speak back to television. You don't argue. It's not like radio where you might have talk back. Generally speaking, you just broadcast messages out to Indonesians who sit and listen and watch TV. TVRI Berita setiap malam would begin with a berpidato dari Pak Suharto. And Suharto never really said anything particularly fascinating or noteworthy in these announcements. Usually he droned on about Pembangunan or about, Pancasila, these kind of topics. And again, the point is, it wasn't the content of what he was saying. It was the idea that his rightful place in Indonesian television was to start the news bulletin. And so the fact that every news bulletin begins with a speech from Suharto legitimizes his rule as the father of Indonesia, the father of development, and the rightful leader of Indonesia. Scholars like Veven Wardana and other Indonesian scholars like Daniel Dakide and others started to look at how the media manipulated people, how people felt that they were just absorbing content from TVRI without critically analyzing it. And they believed in some cases that television depoliticized. It made people less political because they were watching sinetron and other forms of state-run news that didn't make them think critically. So the Veven Wardana and others would say. So television was absolutely crucial to the content of Suharto and to the idea of the message of development of the Indonesian state. By 1980s, we started to see a new medium that changed the nature of Indonesian politics, society, and media. And that was the satellite television. Satellite television came about in the late 1980s and early 1990s, first through the idea that Indonesians could see other forms of television from Thailand and from Korea and from Malaysia. And largely the Indonesian middle class tended to like to have different channels. They didn't just want to watch TVRI all the time. They liked Thai soap operas. They liked Malaysian dramas. And so Suharto found this very difficult. There was this new medium of satellite TV, and Indonesians wanted different channels. They didn't just want TVRI. So what was he to do? He was feeling under pressure. There was demand. There was this new medium. People wanted to be part of the middle class. He said he was pro-development. There was this new technology which was developing. How does he deny it? Well, he can't reject it completely if you're Suharto. He has to allow some form of television, satellite television, to enter Indonesia. But what he does, quite understandably, is he gives these new satellite television stations to his daughter, to his son, and to his business partners. And these people started to form a very new form of power in the Indonesian media at that time. This is where scholars call them the family phase. But we started to see how television like RCTI became part of Suharto's son Bambang, where we had SCTV, which was under the control of Suharto's stepbrother, and then various other oligarchs like Peter Sondak, Abu Rizal Bakri, who you would know, Agung Laksono, who created ANTV later. In addition, Anthony Salim established the television station Indosiar. So satellite television threatened the way in which the state controlled the mainstream media. The new channels were created for commercial reasons, but suddenly we started to see various news broadcasts on the commercial stations as well. And suddenly business started to take place over New Order government policy. Suharto then ultimately was left with these new power dynamics to manage in the late 1990s. The arrival of satellite television facilitated new power structures around the ownership of media in Indonesia. It highlighted the shifting nature of the regime, and it allowed for oligarchs to be formed who started to become very powerful in the way that they used media in order to promote their own business and political interests. And so when Suharto stepped down, it was these kind of oligarchs that were now more central in Indonesian media and politics because of the arrival of satellite television. However, it wasn't satellite television which brought down Suharto. It wasn't satellite television which was the new media which radically changed the way Indonesians sought broader political change. In fact, that was the new medium of the internet. By the late 1990s, advances in global communication saw the arrival of the internet in 1997, coinciding with the Asian financial crisis, which precipitated the eventual resignation of Suharto and the end of his regime. As scholars like Krishna Sen, photographed there, or Melina Lim have shown, the internet was crucial in overcoming censorship barriers which existed in the print media and highlighted the lack of freedom in other forms of Indonesian media. Now, this doesn't mean that the internet created reformasi. Reformasi occurred for a number of reasons, but the internet gave agency and autonomy to student groups like yourselves, to reformasi activists, to people who wanted to overcome censorship, and people who joined together to create legitimate discourse about democracy in Indonesia and bringing down the Suharto regime and the problems of the New Order regime. This is not to say that other media weren't crucial, but ultimately we started to see the importance of reformasi to the internet to reformasi in order to allow for usurping government-sponsored modes of production and as a vital medium in enabling ordinary Indonesians to use online platforms to assist with messages expressing the need for wider political change. So in conclusion, my summary here in just the first part of my talk, my summary here goes back through Indonesia's media history. And I argue that new media technologies have been central to facilitating or supporting transitions within Indonesian politics and society. Benedict Anderson's study focuses on the role of print media in promoting nationalism. Scholars who examine Suharto's authoritarian rule emphasize the importance of television and mass media as crucial to the military regime. Finally, Satellite television created this stratum of oligarchs and the new power structures as the new order started to take different forms and eventually collapse. And ultimately, the online forms of communication were central to promoting the messages of Reformasi, as the new medium of the internet allowed for subversive messages to circumvent state censorship. So this leads me to the meaning of my work and the purpose that I have when thinking about Indonesian digital media. And that is, if the medium is digital, what is the message? And this is largely what I find fascinating about Indonesia. This is the question, the urgent question of our time. This is the question that I admit that I do not have all of the answers to, and neither does anyone really. But I think it's important to try to debate it, to discuss it, to try and think about the impact that digital media has on Indonesian society. And in the books that I published and in my scholarship, I've tried to ask that similar question: whose autonomy is enhanced by digital media? Who gains power from digital media? Who becomes more powerful through digital media? These are the questions that I think are crucial as we try and understand the shifting nature of society, both in Indonesia and indeed around the world. It's a challenge for all countries. It's not unique to Indonesia, but as I've explained, Indonesia is central to this question for so many reasons, but in large part because of the nature of uptake of digital media practices and the way in which digital media is often entrepreneurial and used in new and exciting ways. In fact, I would admit that Indonesian media is far more interesting than Australian media, which is still bogged down in print media forms and Rupert Murdoch trying to put out pro-Liberal Party messages through newspapers, that ultimately Indonesia is more advanced and more entrepreneurial in the way that it uses digital media for society and politics. Australia is still in a long way stuck in 20th century forms of media, of Rupert Murdoch dominance, and of the nature of political communications. It's still very much mainstream media rather than entrepreneurial and advanced. So I'll give you three quick answers that I'd like to throw out, three quick ideas that I'd like to throw out, and then we can discuss. The first argument that one would make, and that I have made in the book Media Power in Indonesia, and one which you probably know already because it's the most widely sort of discussed when it comes to my work and the work of others with regard to oligarchs, is that ultimately digitalization concentrates power and can be used as a tool for the oligarchs. And my argument here would be that while the internet created this fantastic new form of reformasi spirit, and in the early days, social media was a really exciting place for activism on Facebook, on change.org, on Twitter, and created some of these things like the Twitter revolutions in the Middle East and so on. Ultimately, oligarchs adapted, and they adapted by taking control of the communication platforms and by centralizing their media businesses by making them large digital conglomerates. And those digital conglomerates don't just own a television station anymore, or they don't just own a newspaper. Their media businesses are online, print, television, radio, digital, social media, events, marketing, and so on. And the overarching argument that the oligarchs are trying to do is concentrate power and wealth through a process of digitalization. And so what we're seeing here is that powerful figures have taken over the digital space, that they see themselves as being able to control that space, either by owning the media technologies themselves or by controlling the message or manipulating the message through state-sponsored buzzers, through private trolls or cyber troopers or buzzers or these kind of actors, which are now prominent in South Australia and in Southeast Asia, and where legitimate public discourse is repressed either by powerful oligarchs or by those who pay others to manipulate and suppress those kind of messages. And so one argument of the medium being the message is that the medium of digital creates a message of digital conglomerates and ultimately oligarchic power. The second argument might be that digital media can still be an extension of pro-democracy that enables for a more participatory society, and it can counter ruling elites. And in other words, the message here is a positive one, that we shouldn't give up hope, that certain organizations like Kawal Pemilu and Kawal COVID and other forms of digital media activism still play an important role in spreading the messages of NGOs, LSMs, of activist groups, of other organizations such as student groups, who ultimately are still going to use digital media in the most entrepreneurial way. The rise initially of President Joko Widodo from local mayor in Solo to governor of Jakarta to now president of Indonesia could be seen as an example of a more participatory media environment in Indonesia, where you had someone come from the outside to become president. So this is not to say, what I'm saying is it can happen again. It's happened before and it can happen again. But ultimately, it's through new forms of media, digital media, that these activists and reformers are going to have most autonomy. And that might happen in places that the government and the oligarchs are yet to understand, are yet to control. TikTok, Instagram, new forms of digital media production that are still yet to be understood by the ruling powers can still be increasingly participatory, and there is still some kind of possibility. The third and final argument that one might say of the medium and the message is that digital media ultimately creates more algorithms, more filter bubbles, more echo chambers, and it ultimately establishes an emotive base of polarization. And the concern here would be that while digital media is indeed participatory, while it does lead to more voices from the bottom up, and it does lead to more emotional and important arguments from civil society, that ultimately it tweaks these arguments and pushes these arguments into polarized, emotive debates, which are ultimately bad for the country. And this we've seen in America under Donald Trump. We're seeing currently in the Philippines with the election of Marcos Jr., the son of the former dictator Marcos, Ferdinand Marcos, and the sort of divide between certain sectors of society who see the country going in one direction, which is completely different to how the other half of the country see the Philippines should be going. Similarly in America, similarly in Brexit in the UK, the idea that UK should be completely separate from Europe, while the other half of British people say UK needs to be central and involved in European affairs. That there's this enormous divide. And in Indonesia too, we are seeing this growing divide about how people envisage the nature of the Indonesian state. Should Islam play a greater role in state affairs, or should Islam be separate from state affairs in an Indonesian secular state? And we're seeing a greater divide of that. Does social media drive that? Is social media a factor in bringing about that polarization, or has that always been there? These are the debates that we need to be having when we think about the medium being the message. Ultimately, does medium lead to a more polarized society? So, of course, Southeast Asia is crucial for answering these kind of questions. And I've given you some examples of why we see Southeast Asia as so crucial. But just to reiterate, you know all of this anyway, but just to reiterate that we need to think about how digital media operates in Indonesia and Southeast Asia in different ways to the way it might in the West. What are some of the differences, or indeed China or India or elsewhere? What are some of the differences that we see? And one thing is we are seeing this rise of these terms of buzzers, of trolls, of cyber troopers. We're seeing the growth of Facebook advertising and the idea of a campaign hitam being far more central to an election campaign now, even more so in Southeast Asia than we would see at, say, in Australia, where there is currently an election going on. So the prominent labor force, the ubiquity of WhatsApp, of Instagram, of Facebook has meant that Southeast Asia is central. So in conclusion, I think it's great to open this up to discussion and to questions, because as I said, I don't have all the answers. In the book of Media Power, I try to explain the rise of oligarchs. I try to explain the growing power that they have had over Indonesian society and the way in which they've used digitalization to become more powerful and more engaged in politics and power. But that does not mean that is the only answer to this question of if the medium is digital, what is the message? And so at this point, I'd like to stop and thank everyone for their attendance. It's wonderful to see so many people here, and I'll turn this over to questions and debate and discussion. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Ross, for the beautiful presentation. There is a lot of pointers that I would like to point out. Talking about the medium is the message, and then after at the end, what is the message actually? So I would like to open the question and answer session right now. So if anyone who would like to ask a question or to debate on what is being told by Dr. Ross, you can write down on the chat column. So I'm still waiting for that answer. So yeah, while we're waiting for the question, probably there are three. You're pointing out three of the important. What do you call it? Underline that being underlined here. It's about that digitalization is creating powerful tools for oligarchs. First of all, that, and then the second one is the extension of pro-democracy, and then to become the participatory society, and at the end, the participatory media creates sectarianism, and then the politicians are establishing the emotional base, such as if you see the number 1 and number 2 in 2019's presidential election is really creating the base, not the fan base. It's actually political fan base in a way. So being called like Kadrun and Cebong as well. That's I think it's part of the development of digital media today, because it is developing in Twitter and then Instagram as well, and also in Facebook for a long time, and it's kind of like prolonging the Kadrun and Cebong status until today, even after the election as well. I think it's that's the power of digital today, because it's created, as we know that digital are creating user. So this content is created by the users, not by the industry or media industry as well. So it's a bit more freedom for people to even express themselves. As I said before, you can post your question in the chat box, or probably some of the audience, some of the lecturers is here as well, Ross, and I'm pretty sure that they have a lot of questions. You can ask Ross in Indonesia as well, because I think Ross is pretty capable of answering in Indonesia. Because if you if you're afraid to talk in English, or you can talk in English as well. I can actually translate a little bit if you want to. Is there any question or any topic that we can discuss furthermore with Ross? This is a very interesting lecture, I think. Probably Ari is chatting it privately with me said that this the material in this lecture is pretty what do you call it? It's daging. What do you call it? It's very thick in a way. So this the term is daging in Indonesia. It's really good, and there's a lot of things that we could discuss furthermore from this one. So yeah, I'm still waiting for a question from the audience. Probably Professor Eddie, the newly professor that we have, Prof. Eddie, if you would like to ask a question or like to discuss something. Okay. So yeah, talking about the lecture is talking about from the history before the talking about the McLuhan medium is the message, talking about the how printed media become one of the what do we call it, the pioneer in spreading the information, spreading the power as well, spreading the ideas, and then it's moving on. Every revolution, industrial revolution, creates a new media that's being used to spread the information and spread the ideology as well. And then now we're having this digital era where digital is being what do you call it, the leader in spreading information and ideology as well. Okay, I've got a question from Rifki Nur. How could the digital media that can connect world society in turn tends to make polarization? Yeah, you would like to answer that straight away, Ross, or?
Sure, yeah. So one of the big things, the challenges around the world, not just in Indonesia, is the rise of the digital political campaign industry. And this has been described in a whole number of ways. One term that I like to use is the disinformation industry, but it's also around digital campaigning, digital campaigning for elections and for any form of sort of public relations is shifting in the digital era. And we are now seeing a new form of labor force, which is basically hiring people to create messages and to promote messages in order to win an election or to, get your product sort of in the digital space, whatever it might be. But in the case of elections, we're seeing this rise of disinformation industry. And sometimes people like to refer to them as trolls in the Philippines or buzzers in Indonesia. But essentially what we're saying here is that the aim of this new labor force is to push very emotive and very specific agendas, which ultimately may not be good for society. And the more that we appeal to the emotions and the hearts on certain issues, the more that we get people angry and fired up, the more likely we are to get them to care a lot about an issue and therefore vote for a candidate. So a classic example of this would be Duterte in the Philippines, who ran on a campaign of drugs and crime. And a lot of the industry that he helped create, or that his PR executives created, were people who were creating news stories on Facebook about the rising drug lords in the Philippines, about crime in local areas by drug dealers, by the fact that the Philippines was apparently run as a narco state, and this idea that drugs was central to Philippine society. Now, if you looked at the evidence of that, you would find that drugs is no more of a problem in the Philippines than it is in many other countries around the world, and that the Philippine state is not a narco state. It's not run by narco drug lords like, you might argue is the case of Colombia or something. So it was really a manufactured narrative through social media that made Filipinos think that drugs was a bigger problem in society than it really was. And then, of course, the solution to that problem, the solution to drugs and crime, is a neo-authoritarian leader like Rodrigo Duterte. And so this is part of the problem with the nature of polarizing people, is to push them into these agendas which make them angry, which make them feel viscerally sort of emotional about something that may not necessarily exist. And we can see this also in the case of Indonesia. A lot of the things that people get really fired up about online are not necessarily like legitimate issues that Indonesia should really be worried about. And the cebong kind of kampret stuff, that's very similar. They were arguing about things that were manufactured by the industry itself. And this ultimately pushes people into camps. Now, in the television era, we came up with laws, right? We said you can only advertise for this many hours during an election period. And you have to have equal amounts of advertising on television between candidates. And you can't attack an opponent on a television ad, right, in certain ways. That there was a form of advertising for politics and elections on TV, which you could do, and that could be negative campaigning, but you couldn't do campaign hitam on TV, right? It just wouldn't be allowed by the KPI. Now on social media, you can do all of this stuff. There is no regulation. And it's much more like the Wild West of political advertising. And this ultimately leads to a rise in campaign hitam, a rise in polarization, and a rise of this importance of the disinformation industry.
Yeah, it's very interesting that it's kind of bit like that polarization is being made with intention to put the one of the political parts to rise against the other, and digital media creates that things that not being allowed in broadcast media is you can curse, you can mock the opposition as well in social media. That's the I think one of the biggest problem in how people connect in internet and digital is that, I mean, there's kind of like we need an ethic of how things should be done in internet, like that we have done in broadcast media as well, like what KPI does. What KPI does is kind of like using creating some rules in which people have to do things that according to law. I think is that probably it's not easy task to do in what we call the digital area now. Okay, so Ross, we got another interesting question from Dennis Rachel. First of all, she's asking about Philippines election. Her Twitter timeline is being flooded by photos of Lenny Kiko, which is the position of the market. And a lot of them talk about how dangerous it is to have Ferdinand Marcos' son, which is a lot of people in 80s knows that Ferdinand Marcos is really, what do you call it, rule with his iron hand. But eventually that Ferdinand Marcos' son is now winning the election. Does this mean that the power of the internet is actually not that big? Because eventually the power, the sound, what do you call it, the voice from the internet is not strong enough to withdraw, to usurp the Ferdinand Marcos' son in Philippine case. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, great question. And I've been trying to follow the Philippines election as closely as possible because Philippines is always fascinating with social media, digital media production. So many Filipinos are on Facebook. Facebook is the internet for so many. And it was so crucial in Duterte, of course. So my reading of the Philippines election personally, and this is often reading from other people's work, I wasn't there during the campaign, was that the Marcos Jr. regime and campaign began much, much earlier. And a lot of the messages that the Marcos campaign was pushing on social media, not just TikTok, but on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and so on, was to reinvent history, to say that the Marcos regime of the 1970s and 80s was ultimately a glory years for the Philippines. And this was very influential, and it's been happening for about 6 years. Remember, Marcos Jr. ran for vice president 6 years ago. He just missed out. And so there's been this steady growth of trying to convince Filipinos that the previous era of Philippine history under Marcos was a better era than there is today. Now, this is really interesting when we compare to Indonesia, because most Indonesians look at the New Order period and they don't recall it as being a good thing, right? They tend to not want to go back to the New Order. New Order is not a glory days. Suharto was not some glorious president, the way that Filipinos might think about Marcos. However, the point in Philippines is that we've really had 6 years of a digital media campaign trying to convince younger Filipinos who weren't alive during the Marcos era that actually it was a much better time and that the Philippines could return to that wonderful period of history. Now, the question I would ask you, and I don't know the answer myself, but I would ask you as Indonesians, if there was a really strong digital media campaign by a select group of oligarchs and powerful business people who funded a campaign to say the Orde Baru was a glorious time in Indonesian history, that there was this spectacular growth and development, and people were earning money and people were happy, and it was ordered through digital media, through TikTok and Instagram. Do you think that younger Indonesians would buy into that idea? Or do you think that they would largely dismiss that campaign as being a campaign of buzzers? And I don't know the answer. I tend to think that New Order period is, people don't look at Tommy Suharto and wish he was president. But the question is, it was such a successful campaign on digital media to rewrite history in the Philippines that you do wonder about the power that digital media had. By the time Lenny's campaign came along and the pink movement, just 6 months before the election, it was too late. And she was only just trying to make up ground. And the circles you were in were largely the filter bubble of the progressive liberal, largely pluralistic, globalized, English-speaking voters of the Philippines. So I don't know the answer to what a rewriting of history would look like on digital media for Indonesia, but I would worry that it's more powerful than we think.
Well, yeah, but you've proven back that actually the digital media is really powerful in that matter because Lenny and Kiko is creating their campaign later on. Near the election, rather than Ferdinand Marcos Jr., who tries to create that story, the myth of the 80s Philippines being the glorious days of Philippines. So yeah, I think it's proven that one of the proven fact that digital media is really actually powerful in a way. So we have to, if you want to make it successful, you have to create it earlier. Like what probably Ferdinand Marcos Jr. had already done in Philippines, I think. Yeah, comparing to Indonesia, well, I couldn't really answer that question as well, Ross. I mean, a lot of people here probably couldn't answer it as well because, yeah, the netizen in Indonesia really kind of like flowing in what topics that matters and what that doesn't matter. That a lot of people trying to brought up the Orde Baru era to up, but actually they're being pushed away by the recent event probably. It's kind of like difficult probably in Indonesia, but I just suspected that, but I don't know about other people here. Yeah, okay, we'll probably put that the topic in our book rack just for a moment. We're having another question from Data. This is our lecturer as well in Faculty of Communication, focusing on digital culture and political data, talking about digital political research and industry, what kind of tension that you think might happen between government, industry, and maybe from the political oligarchs to the platform government in Indonesia, as well as Indonesia is currently studying the GDPR, as well as Singapore FMA and other development of regulation which are addressing the digital industry. So probably you can answer that better than me, I think.
Yeah, thanks. Great question, and a really evolving topic. I wrote about in the book around the way in which the political oligarchs shaped digital television stations by giving the frequencies to their own stations and to making sure that, the powerful owners of the major Jakarta conglomerates were able to get frequencies to broadcast their messages nationwide. And ultimately, the power of oligarchs became more concentrated in Jakarta, and news in Indonesia became more Jakarta-centric. And so we started to really see the decline of local news in local news TV stations and the rise of national TV stations and their power, such as Metro TV and TV1 and so on. The digital space is much more complex and, as I said, much more evolving. And governments are still trying to figure it out. On the one hand, they tend to like this sort of freedom where they can buy out a lot of the discourse. And if you were in charge of a bunch of buzzers or you were manipulating the social media arguments, you tend to not want to regulate that. It's not in your interests. So we often don't see laws that crack down, for example, on political campaigning. We don't see laws that crack down on the PR digital industry itself. What we see is laws that crack down on individual citizens who might speak out against authority or power. And this is the problem with laws like POFMA in Singapore that you mentioned, with the anti-fake news law in Malaysia, which famously described fake news as news which is false or fake. What kind of definition is that, right? Like fake news is news which is fake. Well, great. How do you define that? Or any other form of law such as Undang-Undang ITE in Indonesia, which ultimately is very vague, and it's often used by the powerful people to crack down on the powerless, those who speak out against businessmen, religious figures, political figures, governments, the president himself. And so when you talk about regulation, there's actually not a lot of regulation of the industry, but there's regulation of individuals and cracking down of sporadic cases in order to instill a fear amongst the populace that you cannot speak out against powerful figures. And this is a problem for a lot of countries, not just Indonesia with Undang-Undang ITE, but it's with a number of countries. And again, the problem is really that the tech platforms in Silicon Valley, in Los Angeles, in California, in San Francisco, in California, have generally decided that they don't want to get involved in regulation of the digital disinformation industry. So the weakness, on the one hand, of the Western Silicon Valley platforms has meant that governments feel like they have a right to step in. And so it's a problem of authoritarian governance, but it's also a problem of weak regulation in America as well.
So it's all connected together because the industry is needing the content. The tech industry actually need the netizen content to become their content as well. So the regulation is really hard to do. I mean, yeah, as you said, the Undang-Undang ITE is usually used to penalize people that are actually just saying something in their own private, semi-private environment in social media. So yeah,
it can be just a WhatsApp group or something, right? Or a Facebook group, which is a closed group, and then you report to And I think, look, to the president's credit, to Jokowi's credit, he has said previously that he would like to see a revision of Undang-Undang ITE, that he feels like it should be revised. But unfortunately, the task force which was created to look into this seems like they're coming up with an even worse solution to the current problem. So
Yeah.
I think the president was right when he said that this current system of reporting people in their WhatsApp group, this is terrible. This is not a future for Indonesia. And Jokowi was right. But now it's up to the DPR and the other committee to come up with a good solution.
Yeah, we're still waiting for it. I mean, yeah, that's the solution that we are still waiting for. I'm moving on to other questions. Some of the audience give me the private chat about. It's kind of like different from the previous one. This is from Shauki. What is your view on the future development of digital media? We have heard of the concept of Metaverse, using avatars. How would message be contained in the sphere that makes AR and virtual identity in the future? What do you think about the future development of this Metaverse?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I've got to admit, I don't, in many ways, like I'm still figuring out what's happened over the past 10 years to get us to where we're at, to even understand what's going to happen in the next 10 years. Scholars we're always trying to figure out what just went, how do we explain what just happened? The metaverse, again, is this idea that Facebook and Zuckerberg and so on are not just going to be central to social media discourse, they're going to be part of this wider digital conglomerate network. And ultimately what they want, as they've always said that they want, is more and more power. That's why Facebook bought Instagram. It's why they bought WhatsApp. They're trying to monopolize the market. That's why when you see big digital conglomerates like Gojek or Grab or whatever to become part or merge with Tokopedia, or to become part of a events function and shopping and so online shopping, e-commerce, everybody wants to be a bigger and bigger conglomerate, which is ultimately a function of late capitalism, right? And so the question really is, how long does late capitalism last? How long before these monopolies become so uber powerful, so overpowerful, that there is no competition and there is no flourishing of a capitalist society, because we're basically owned by monopolies and conglomerates. And so I look at it as in a question of late capitalism and how digital media is leading to that. And that is ultimately not good for society. Monopolies and market dominance of one digital conglomerate is ultimately a bad thing. And I think we need to think about how to diversify. And America should have an antitrust law, right? And a law which they should break up Instagram and Facebook, and they should break up WhatsApp from Facebook and allow other owners to own those platforms so that Facebook can't dominate the market. And that goes for Meta or whatever other big digital conglomerate is being formed, Amazon, these kind of companies, Google. It would be better to have a more diverse market. That's at the heart of capitalism. Late capitalism is about monopolization and conglomerates.
Yeah, so the message conveyed in actually Metaverse is actually using the capitalism background as their way of the capitalism. I mean, the message they're being conveyed in Metaverse as well. So this is the other question is actually connected to what you have been tell before. It's about what do you think about Elon Musk taking over the Twitter? I mean, is it so Elon Musk is actually this one is from Rachel. She asked about how about the Elon Musk taking over the Twitter, creating what kind of environment is he going to create in Twitter? As he said before, I mean, Elon Musk is always said about free speech in Twitter, and you can talk about anything. And actually, some of the people is being blocked by Elon Musk in Twitter as well, because now he's the single owner of Twitter now. So, what do you think about Elon Musk and the Twitter are creating is it going to create another bad environment for the free speech, or is it going to move to a better way of having the platform for free speech?
Yeah, it seems clear to me that Elon Musk has this view that freedom of speech is under threat, which is really the opposite of what a lot of scholars are saying largely about the nature of social media. Rather, they say that it's the loudest voice that wins. Someone like Donald Trump, who is the most controversial, who is the most, in some cases, racist, and the most populist, that social media advances people who speak more freely. So for Elon Musk to say that there's this problem, he's obviously, largely referring to Twitter banning Trump. And so Elon Musk has then come out and said, no, I would let Trump back on the platform. And the problem with that kind of approach is that ultimately it is saying that people like Trump and the way that they use Twitter are important for a healthy democratic society. And as we've seen with Trump, there is nothing healthy or democratic about a Trump presidency. It's been a disaster for America and a terrible thing for global democracy. So in many ways, I disagree with the worldview of Elon Musk. I'm sure we lead very different lives. He probably has a little bit more money than I have. His car is probably better. But I don't understand this worldview that sort of freedom of speech is under threat on Twitter. And this is the sort of view of the American liberal sort of the American right, the conservative right, that there is this crackdown on freedom of speech. Well, in fact, the challenge is how to create a healthier public discourse so that persecuted people do not feel that digital media is attacking them, and so that minorities are not impacted by people like Trump and Bolsonaro and Duterte and so on. That's the challenge for society at the moment. And ultimately, I can't see Elon Musk's worldview being good for a healthy digital public sphere.
So you have different view about it. So so you think that Elon Musk taking over Twitter is a good idea it's a good idea, or
Well, I'm only going on the public statements he's made, and apparently, according to reporting in New York Times and others, that this is not a good business decision, right? To buy Twitter for $46 million, like that doesn't make sense. So when Elon Musk is talking about why he bought it, he's saying it's to make the platform better, but also to allow for greater freedom of speech on the platform. But as we know, that hasn't been Twitter's major problem. Twitter's biggest problem is things like, bot accounts. It's been the way that minorities and other fringe groups are persecuted. It's been the way that women are attacked online and are sexually harassed and abused. These are the big issues with Twitter, not the conservative right elements like Trump, who had their time on the platform. I don't understand the worldview. I think if we're going to create a healthier digital public sphere, we need to be thinking about how to make a safer online space, not a space for, people like Trump to be back on the platform.
Yeah. That's I think that's a good point of view to think about. Yeah. I think this is the last question that we have from Abdullah Gifar. I think since the beginning of the racism of the media, the political economy of the media and the center of the media is the same, which is the owner of political power, and there's the okay. When the message in the media is not in line with political and economic authorities, then what is the difference between then and now, the era of conventional media and new media? So yeah, what is different between the broadcast, probably the broadcast media era and the digital media era nowadays?
It's a really interesting question. Yeah, great question. My colleague Ed Aspinall has written about the way in which the student movement has been suppressed, and his argument in New Mandala is that it's really the old style campaign of cracking down on activists. And there's a new form, they're doing it via digital media now, but ultimately the tactic of cracking down on activists and students is largely what we saw during the New Order, when we look at the crackdown on students during the omnibus protests and so on. So that's what Ed thinks on that. And in a way, you could say that is the same with turning off the internet in Papua or Jakarta after the election, where they turned, slowed down the internet for a while there. The idea being that the government should be able to censor or take down content and even platforms, even the media itself, when there is some kind of issue. Now, NGOs have tried to appeal to the court, and the court in the Pengadilan in Indonesia has basically said that, yes, this was problematic, that you shouldn't be able to cut off the internet, that might lead to a more unsafe environment. So as usual with Indonesia, like the NGOs and the groups who are fighting government are often the most inspirational people in the country. And the fact that they fought the government on this is an impressive thing. But ultimately, the thinking is really the same, isn't it? It's that in order to control society, we have to control the media. And yeah, that is a dangerous sort of worldview. It's a worldview of China. It's a worldview of Russia at the moment. They don't want to have a free and open democratic media space online. And the danger is that governments around the world start to see the China or the Russia model as a good form of governance, or at least an easy form of governance in order to hold on power. And that, I think, is a real threat, as Silicon Valley and the US doesn't do enough to regulate their platforms. And as we as society stop thinking about these questions and we don't find solutions ourselves, governments will step in and say, well, you know what? China did it pretty well. They handle the media space really well. And we start to see copying of models like that. And there's to varying degrees, right? Australia has also tried to implement various regulations in laws which are anti sort of freedom of democratic governance on social media. They say it's to crack down on trolls and so on. But the danger is that we see a model where national governance and national control over the internet dominates, rather than a global public sphere which sees, a wider range of views and platforms and websites for everyone to access, which was ultimately the aim of the internet in the first place, right? That everyone should be able to access all of this material around the world for free. And once we start having governments stepping in saying, no, you can't do that, we're only going to let you see this kind of material that we promote or that we approve, that is a problem for the overall ideals of what the internet should be.
Okay. Yeah. So, I think probably some of us would see the world in a pessimistic way, somehow. I mean, when all the nations try to restrict people to have the freedom of speech and at least restrict on what they can see, it's probably bad for our future. I mean, in a pessimistic way, we can see that like that. So I'm going to ask you for the conclusion remark for today. I mean, I think. Yeah, I think we already it's 11:34 in Indonesia now. So okay, you can have the closing remark for today's general lecture.
No, thank you very much, everyone. Terima kasih banyak semua. It's it's been lovely to be part of this. As I said, I'm very much kangen for Indonesia and look forward to hopefully seeing you someday in Bandung. It's been wonderful to be part of the discussion. Thank you to everyone there at the Fakultas Komunikasi Universitas Padjadjaran for all of your hard work in promoting. It's great to see over 250 people on Zoom and I believe more on YouTube, which is quite an honor, and I'm very humbled by that. So, thank you again and appreciate your attendance.
Okay. from Public Relations Study Program, I would like to thank you as well for coming to this general lecture, and thank you very much for the people involved in here. This general lecture is actually, giving us a lot of insights that really we could before we couldn't think about it, but you just open the door on things that not being seen before for us. So thank you very much, Ross, for coming, and we're probably going to see you again next week in more small classes with Prof. Annie in 24th of May. Thank you very much, and I hope you getting better. I hope your tomorrow's result would be great, so we can see next week. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming to this general lecture, and for the students and also the lecturers and also our dean, Padjadjaran Rahmat. Thank you very much for coming, and also some of the professors here. Thank you very much for coming, and we're really sorry if there's any mistakes or saying that were not feel good for you guys. Oh yeah, I forgot that we have to have that photo session. We actually we actually scheduled it at the beginning of the general lecture, but now I just reminded by Annie that we have to have that photo session. If you don't mind, Rose, we can have that photo session. Okay, Annie, you can take the photo. You still unmute. You can unmute yourself, Annie, so you can give us. Okay.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, all participants, please open your camera. Okay, I will take the picture for slide, the first slide. Okay, smile, 3, 2, 1. Okay, we move to the next slide. Okay, get ready. Okay, and 3, 2, 1. Okay, and the next slide, the third slide. Okay, let's open your camera. Okay, thank you. Get ready, 3, 2, 1. Okay. The next slide. Okay, you can give some reaction if you don't mind. Okay. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you very much, Ross, for sparing your time to come to the general lecture. Thank you very much for everyone who's being involved in this general lecture, and everyone who's coming and from coming in the Zoom and at YouTube as well. So thank you very much. We're going to see you in another time, probably for another general lecture from other scholars that in communication studies. Thank you very much, Ross, for the time. I guess I'll see you next week, hopefully.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Sandy.